We play and call it work.
Hello everyone and welcome back to MiniWarGaming. Something really exciting about this series of lore that I'm doing is that the guys at MiniWarGaming are going to do a battle report based on the stuff that you learn in the video. That's really exciting because you get to hear about the story and then you get to see how those events played out on the tabletop. So make sure you click the link in the description so that you can head over to the exclusive video on the MiniWarGaming Vault. I'm sure it's going to be absolutely brilliant and I can't wait to watch that myself. This is the series where we go and take a look at the lore of Age of Sigmar and try and make you at least have some kind of foundation of knowledge about what the whole thing is all about. A quick note at the start, I have my own channel, some of you may already know about it already, but it's called Kitetsu, so if you like this video, maybe go and check that out for all things related to Age of Sigmar. In part 1 of this series, we did a huge overview of many hundreds, if not thousands of years of storyline, spanning the history of the mortal realms. From now onwards, I'm going to go back and look at each of the major time periods from part 1 in more detail. This video will focus on the Age of Myth, and actually it's a very interesting time period for Age of Sigmar. So much happens during it. I think most people would assume that it's not that important because the focus of this time period is not on conflict, but on creation and a sense of wonder. The early books also kind of label it as this period of time where everything's been lost and therefore no one knows too much about what happened during it. But actually we know tons about it now. Far too much for just this one video. Every battle tome that comes out adds more detail, and it's a great period of time that establishes our introduction to the world of Age of Sigmar and the realms. And more importantly, it's the age where we get to meet all of the gods of Age of Sigmar. We learn about their origin stories, how they meet Sigmar and befriend him, and they are really at the heart of pretty much everything in the story. I will focus a lot of this video on the gods of Age of Sigmar therefore. But that being said, it is true that almost everything that gets built in this glorious age is later destroyed by Archaon during the Age of Chaos. In the current timeline of Age of Sigmar, there is little tangible evidence left at all of what occurred during this time, but all of the books and battle tomes give us loads of nuggets of information that help us piece it all together. And as I said, we're left knowing quite a lot about it. So depending on when Matthew releases this video, I'm recording it long before the new edition and core book comes out. So I don't doubt that by the time you watch this, there's going to be even more information out there about the Age of Myth. But as of recording it, this is pretty much up to date. As with the last video, I have to say from the offset that this topic is large enough for a whole series in its own right. So I can't talk about it in completely exhaustive detail. I'm just going to pick out some of the key events. So let's get started. Last time we learned about the destruction of the old world and the conflicts that spanned its globe. That was all brought about by Archaon. The Age of Myth is the polar opposite of those turbulent times. It's generally considered to be a tranquil, majestic, golden age where Sigmar is off exploring the realms and solidifying his reputation as a powerful and well-respected deity. But actually there is a dark side to the Age of Myth as well, and that lies with Archaon. He's still alive, basically, and the destruction of the old world did not stop him. Sigmar is off having a great time, living in blissful peace in the relatively young mortal realms, whereas Archaon, on the other hand, is in the realm of chaos, and he is literally tearing across it in a rampage of death and destruction that sees him rise in power to become the most powerful servant of the Dark Gods. Thanks to his crusade through the realm of chaos over nearly countless years, he transforms from the terrible general that he was in the old world to a monster, a demigod of chaos that ends up crushing the mortal realms in his ironclad fist. That's basically what happens immediately after the Age of Myth. He ultimately goes on to defeat Sigmar in the Battle of the Burning Skies, and Sigmar has to retreat back to Azir and lock himself away for 500 years to plan his counterattack. Basically at that stage, there's no one really left that can oppose Archaon. But the Age of Chaos is for the next video. As for this one, I'm going to focus it more on Sigmar and the gods that he meets in the realms. So the old world is destroyed, Sigmar is flying through space for countless years on Malus, the glowing core of the world that was. Due to the destruction of the old world, magic and matter bursts out across the universe and it condenses down into 8 mortal realms. They are these flat spinning discs floating in the void, held together by magic. Many races from the old world mysteriously awaken in these new realms, but there were some races who actually had the foresight to escape the old world immediately before its destruction. For example, a small number of wizards survived and they cast spells in desperation that ensured their survival and transported them to these strange new lands. Due to the difference in timescales involved, who knows how they managed it and what compromises they had to make to ensure their survival, but nevertheless, some of them managed to do so. The Chaos Warriors that actually destroyed the old world itself opened up these portals to the realm of chaos, and they were gladly welcomed there to join in with the endless wars of the rivaling gods. Many of them remained loyal to Archaon, and they went on to become members of his Varangard, each a mighty champion in his or her own right. As an aside, there are actually many mortals existing in the realm of chaos, and there are demons of course too, and in fact there are far more demons than mortals, but it's just something to bear in mind when considering the story as a whole. It's basically the same for the realm of death as well. You'd think it's full of undead, but actually there are plenty of mortals there too. The Skaven that were involved in the end times, they all retreat to their capital Blight City, as the old world around them is beginning to crumble, and that city merged into the realm of chaos. Due to the instrumental role that the Skaven played in tearing apart the old world, including their campaigns against the dwarves and lizardmen, the Skaven factions had grown in power immeasurably. Their god, the Great Horned Rat, was accepted into the pantheon of chaos gods, who mostly look down on him, but then again, he wields a power that is not to be ignored. They have this magical ability where they can tunnel between the realms, and they can also summon their own powerful demons onto the battlefield. Some of the Seraphon also managed to survive the destruction of the old world. They were back then known simply as lizardmen, and thanks to their mighty mages, the Slann, the Seraphon were able to take to the stars to escape the destruction of the old world, and they made these enormous vessels that housed the refugees of their race that fled in desperation from the doomed world. Their armies had failed to hold back the Chaos forces and the Skaven in Lustria, so they had no choice but to flee or go extinct. The story of the Seraphon that survive and make it back to the mortal realms is actually quite interesting, because over the countless years that follow their escape from the old world, most of the Seraphon end up actually dying as they're travelling through space. But a strange thing happens to some of the Slann. Their spirits lived on, refusing to give up and likely not quite able to die due to their enlightened state of magical prowess. Their bodies were dead, but their spirits clung to their lifeless forms, possessing them even in the afterlife basically. As we found out in the last video, Dracothian the Great Drake and God Beast detected Sigmar as he clung to Malus, and he went to Sigmar's aid, revitalising him with a single breath from his magical lungs, and basically a lasting friendship grows between the god and the Zodiac Beast. Sigmar rode Dracothian back to the mortal realms, and they brought Malus with them, setting it high among the stars of Azir, the heavenly realm. Malus is made of Sigmarite, an exceedingly rare and beautiful metal, and Sigmar fashions a necklace from a piece of it, presenting it to Dracothian as a symbol of their friendship. In turn, Dracothian shows Sigmar each of the mortal realms and the magical pathways between them. Although the timeline of these events is a little bit muddied and it can't be said precisely when these events occurred, Sigmar was not the only one that Dracothian detected drifting through the endless void of space. He also picked up on the life force of the aforementioned Slann, the only survivors of the lizardmen that took to the stars. They were truly far from the mortal realm, so he sent out his consciousness to try and connect with their minds, and he was essentially spying on them. But whilst looking into their minds, he saw a terrible vision of basically the memory of the old world being destroyed. The pain that he felt in their minds was so raw and strong that he basically recoiled in horror, and for the first time he understands the ordeals of Sigmar and the other surviving races. he lets out this mighty cry that echoed so loud into the voids of space that the Slann of the Seraphon actually hear it and follow its noise back to Azir. The Slann then build an empire in the stars above Sigmar's palace in Azir, and their long-lost race was returned to reality by the Slann and their magic. Even to this day though, a deep connection exists between Dracothian and the Seraphon, and some think that Dracothian even aided the return of these mythical space reptiles. So basically we end up with thousands of inhabitants populating the newly formed realms. We've got tribes and primitive settlements beginning to spring up, but the races and people that awoke in the new realms were those that had existed in the old world, and yet they were not entirely the same. They were newly formed, not having any knowledge that a world had come before theirs. They didn't know how they'd come to be in these new realms, and some of them didn't really particularly know who they even were. This isn't true for all the races, but it can certainly be thought of as true for the majority of them. They had been born anew in an entirely new setting. The problem with them awakening in this new realm, or realms as it may have been, is that the realms were actually inhabited by some truly frightening creatures of immense scale, power and magic, in those early days at least, and many of these early mortals lived lives of fear and difficulty, suffering at the mercy of these rampaging wild creatures. As Sigmar reached the realms and began to explore them, he met these primitive tribes and peoples. He helped them, in some cases freed them, defeating the mighty monsters that were terrorizing them. These primitive tribes see Sigmar, this god performing feats beyond what they could ever imagine being possible. They see Sigmar as a divine saviour, a miracle that has come to be their redemption and deliverance basically. Sigmar slays the Hydragors of Shaiish and he overthrows the Volk giants in Akshi. We don't even know what these creatures are anymore, they're just creatures of myth and legend. But they were once there, and Sigmar basically freed the realms from their tyranny. All across the realms, things have become safer, they've become more stable. Frequently, Dracothian actually aided Sigmar in these cleansings, swooping down from the heavens with Sigmar riding atop him, and nothing could stand before their might and fury. As Sigmar explores, he discovers that he is not the only god to inhabit the realms. Some have returned from the old world, and some mortals from that ill-fated place have managed to basically transcend into godhood. Alariel, the Everqueen, wakes up in the realms, now the goddess of life. She very much remembers the world that was, and she strongly misses it, and that becomes very important later in the story. But with her, she's bought the soul pods of many of the tree folk that came from the old world, and she plants them, giving rise to the Sylvaneth. Then we have Tyrion, who awakens in Shaiish, and he was one of the greatest elven warriors once, but he wakes up to find himself in unfamiliar surroundings. He couldn't even remember who he was, but slowly realization and remembrance dawned on him, and he wasn't the warrior of old, he was now the Lord of Lumination, the god of light in Shaiish, but the price of godhood was steep, for he was now blind. Fortunately, he found out that he could see through his brother's eyes, and his brother was basically there next to him, and that is Teclis, a very powerful mage beyond compare. Teclis is now basically the eyes of a god, but also his magic is as powerful as it ever was in the old world, if not even heightened in his new role. Deep in their core, as they're looking around Shaiish, they know that it's the place they belong. It's linked to them as they're linked to it. It's their realm, and they're going to create it into their home ultimately. But there's a problem with it. There is no sign of their kin anywhere. There were no elves to be seen in the entire realm. For some reason, most of the elves had just not made the transition from the old world to the new realms, and Tyrion and Teclis were desperate to find them. They were gods with no people, basically. In fact, the reason the elves were all but missing from the realms was due to the fact that their souls had been captured by Nesh. Nesh is obviously the Dark Prince, the Prince of Excess, one of the dark gods of chaos, drawn to the old world like a moth to flame. Nesh had indulged itself in consuming the souls of the elves as they perished in the fires of destruction that eradicated those on the planet, and at first Tyrion and Teclis have absolutely no idea what has happened to their long lost people. It's a chance meeting between the elven gods and Sigmar that triggers them to join his cause. One of the most important events in the history of Age of Sigmar was when Sigmar came to the realisation that he could use the combined power of all the extraordinary beings that he found for the good of the realms and the people. He decided he would form a mighty pantheon of warriors and gods. Together they could build, create and shape the realms. They could civilise its inhabitants, teach them, help them defend themselves, or better yet, make the realms safe enough to never need fear. Together they would be the ultimate power that had ever existed, but a force of good. The fate that befell the old world would be impossible to happen in the new realms. Chaos could never break the power that they all wielded together, or so he hoped. Then we have the Awakening of Malekith, the dark elf of old. He woke up in the newly formed realms, now a changed being and god called Malerion. He found himself surrounded by mist in the realms of shadow. He didn't even have a physical form at the point that his memories slowly started returning to him. His spirit wandered across Ulgu, the realm of shadow, growing angrier all the while. Eventually it was this rage that manifested itself into his physical form. As another elven god, the shadow to Tyrion and Teclis' light, Malerion also sought far and wide across the realms, looking for traces of his own kind, and yet he too was alone. That was until he came across a clearing, a misty glade, and found his mother Morathi. Morathi and Malerion had a long and dark history from the world that was. In its final moments they were bitter enemies, and Morathi had been consumed by the dark god Nesh even before the old world had been destroyed. She had dabbled in dark powers and paid the price. What Malerion beheld in that shadowy glade initially horrified him. His mother had clawed her way from the belly of Slaanesh, but the corruption from within his body had seeped into her very being, and she was now a twisted and dark reflection of her former self. Despite the magic she tried to use to conceal her identity, she was no longer truly the most beautiful being in the world, but a corrupted being with half the body of a snake, quite fitting of her personality. But she was filled with jealousy at the godly power that flowed through her son. He had risen to godhood and she was woefully lacking in power next to him. The two of them met in a flash of anger, old feelings far from forgotten. They would never really trust one another again, and rightly so. But temporarily those feelings were pushed aside and they agreed to work together to find their elven kin. They were then accepted shortly afterwards into Sigmar's pantheon when he again discovered them whilst exploring the realm of shadow. Sigmar even found Nagash, unquestionably one of the realm's most powerful and incredible beings in Shaiish. Nagash is like an intrinsic force. He's very much a part of nature itself, and therefore when the realms reformed, he reformed along with them. He was buried beneath a monumental mountain of stone in the lowest of the underworlds in the world of death. Sigmar frees Nagash and immediately he sets out to form Shaiish into his underworld kingdom, drawing the spirits of the dead to himself, the Lord of Death. Unbeknown to Sigmar, he had just awoken one of his deadliest enemies and one of the biggest threats the realm would ever see, and I don't doubt that to this day he regrets that decision. It's in Charmon, the realm of metal, atop the Iron Mountains, that Sigmar finds two of the Dwarden gods, the dwarven gods basically, Grungni and Grimnir, both trapped where they were found. Without hesitation, Sigmar frees them and they pledge their oaths to him. Grungni, the master metalworker and smith, repaid Sigmar with his crafting abilities, and he establishes the Iron Karak, with himself the figurehead and god of the dispossessed. Grimnir, on the other hand, is a far more fiery being and very much is more the epitome of a warrior god. In exchange for his freedom, he asks Sigmar to name him a worthy foe. He would slay it for Sigmar, and his debt would immediately be paid. He'd have it no other way. But Sigmar ends up naming Volcatrix, the mother of salamanders. She's a mighty god beast that stalked Akshi, the realm of fire, terrorizing its inhabitants. Perhaps Sigmar was cruel to name such a mighty foe. Perhaps it was a test. Either way, Grimnir headed to those ill-fated hills and battled the beast. Such was the might of their clashing that the hills were flattened and both foes were evenly matched. With one final strike, the two beings struck each other and exploded with realm-shaking force. The power of the explosion was so powerful that shards of Grimnir's shattered body were thrown into space and across each of the realms. In that moment, the Fireslayers were born, the sons of Grimnir, and their highest purpose was, and still is, to retrieve the shards of their fragmented god. They believed that in harvesting them all, they may be able to bring him back. By the time Sigmar came to the realms and explored them, each of them had been covered by the Aurochs. It was in Ger, the realm of beasts, that Sigmar discovered their most prolific deity, Gorkamorka. Gorkamorka is a god made up of two entities, and he goes through cycles of fusing and separating. One of the entities is called Gork, and the other Mork. Mork draws his power from trickery and cunning, whereas Gork is channeled into a being of pure ferocity. Sometimes they are fused together as a formidable god, other times they separate and feud with one another. When Sigmar comes across them in the realm of beasts, Gorkamorka is trapped in a colossal living avalanche called Drakatoa. Despite his cunning and power, Gorkamorka was helpless to resist his imprisonment. Sigmar, riding atop Dracothian, dove down and unleashed enough power to free Gorkamorka, but having been frustrated and trapped for so long, like a wild animal, Gorkamorka immediately lashed out at his saviour. He swung his war club and knocked Dracothian senseless. Enraged, Sigmar leapt forwards to subdue his savage attacker, and the two gods end up fighting for 12 days. Their battle shaped the realm around them, forming these great mountains and canyons. Each god was an equal match and neither could best the other. Eventually they collapse in exhaustion for the first time, taking stock of the destruction of the realm around them. They eyed each other up and decided, to be honest, they were better off as allies than enemies. So it was that Gorkamorka ends up joining the pantheon that Sigmar is creating. Sigmar then sets him the task to go and hunt down the remaining beasts that are infesting the realms, and there are so many of these beasts remaining that basically it's a job that keeps him very busy for the foreseeable future. As for Sigmar, he ended up settling in Azir shortly before forming this pantheon. He built a mighty palace called Sigmaron in the heavens, and above Sigmaron he placed Sigendil, a shining star and bright beacon that can be seen from numerous realms. From his throne overlooking Malus, he surveyed the realm of light stretching out below him. Descending from the heavens, he laid the first brick of the great city Azerheim below him, and soon it took shape. It wasn't long before it was filled with representatives of all races and realms, and it was the place that embodied the full might of Sigmar and his pantheon, and basically his vision. Azerheim is now perhaps the oldest and largest city in the realms. It remained unscathed by the realm of chaos and therefore contained signs and architecture indicative of the Age of Myth, where most other cities were basically just torn down and destroyed, leaving behind little trace. To finish things off with this lore story, I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but there were a couple of other noteworthy events that occurred during the Age of Myth. The first was the capture of Silla Nesh. This actually happens very, very late in the Age of Myth, and in fact it's more at the overlap between the Age of Myth and the Age of Chaos, so we will hear a bit more about it in the next video. But basically, Silla Nesh is captured by Morathi, Tyrion, Teclis and Malerion, and they free the elven souls that Silla Nesh was in the middle of attempting to digest. From those they create their own groups of elves, the Elves of Light and the Elves of Shadow. We also get the formation of the Ideneth Deepkin during this time, the first ever elves created from the reclaimed souls, but these ultimately are a failure and are afflicted with terrible issues. In a sense, they get superseded by subsequent elves created by the gods. The very last thing that needs mentioning because it becomes critical to the story are the Allgates. It's hard to say which was more impressive during their prime, the city at the Allgates or Azerheim itself. The Allgates is a region between the realms, almost like a smaller subdimension. The reason it's so important is because it is like a central hub. It has gateways that link all of the 8 mortal realms together, and from here you can immediately travel to any realm. It basically has infinite strategic value. You can outmaneuver any invading army seeking to take the realms, you can rapidly redeploy your own forces. It's an important place. You hold the Allgates, you likely hold the realms. During the Age of Myth, a truly impressive city forms there, filled with many different races and cultures, and it's basically this great meeting place for all of the inhabitants of all of the different realms. Unfortunately, however, it ends up falling to Archaon and it's renamed the 8 Points, but we will talk more about this in a future video. Right, that is basically this video. Don't forget to click the link in the description below so you can go and watch the battle report in the MiniWarGaming Vault. All of those special videos that coincide with this series are going to relate to something that's happened in the video, so it's very exciting and I can't wait to watch them myself. They've got these great ideas for some narrative battles and I think they're going to be very exciting. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching this video. As I said, if you liked it, go head over to my channel Kitetsu, because I cover all things Age of Sigmar, but also don't forget to subscribe to MiniWarGaming, because it is truly an honour for me to be making videos for them. They have been one of my favourite channels forever, and it feels great to be here, as always. Drop them a sub, go watch their battle reports, they're absolutely fantastic, and obviously that means you can keep track of this series as it evolves and develops too, so this is the place to be to watch it. Otherwise, I will see you really soon in the next video, which should be out in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks for watching, I will see you soon.
We play and call it work.